Well, hello, one and all, and welcome to another wonderful episode of Rediscovering Your Passion and Purpose. You know, I'm Patty Stuhlin, and I am the Chief Pathfinder of Pathways with Patty. And today is no exception to the amazing guest that I continue to be blessed to have on my podcast. And my guest today is Tara Gross. She is a trained counselor who serves women with varying addictions. She is an expressive artist, a coach, speaker, mentor, and a thriving single mother. Tara has overcome years of debilitating losses, which left her hopeless and in despair. She made a decision to rise above her catastrophic past and create the life she deserves. Now she uses her professional and personal experience to serve women who are experiencing similar situations to help them rediscover their value and live life on purpose. Tara, welcome so much to the show. I am excited to have you as our guest today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being on.
Well, you know, one of the things when I met with you a couple weeks ago is you telling your story and sharing it. And once again, it reminded me of why I wanted to start this podcast, to bring to light those people that are out there that have had those challenges. They have faced those challenges and obstacles, and through all of it, they continue to make their lives better, make their part of the world better, and they are helping others to do the same thing. And your story is absolutely no difference. So with that said, could you please tell us, a little bit about, about your story and the challenges and the obstacles and what brought you to this very day?
Sure. So I have been through various traumas, various losses in my life. I've had to learn how to surf the wave through those challenges and crisis moments. I will say that, growing up, we grew up in a household that was your average household for the most part, right? And my parents did the best that they could with what they had. Um, and with any household, like there's always some sort of challenge, right?
Sure.
But I will say, you know, through it, I was the oldest. I experienced a lot. There was a lot happening with my family. My dad drank a lot. My mom wanted this family that we all see on TV, that picture perfect family. And with that, they only knew what they grew up with. Right. But being the oldest, I quickly took on that role of feeling like I had to fix everything. And be able to be that glue that brought everybody together.
Set the standard.
And yes. And it was hard. I learned that I became very codependent. I recognized that I focused on other people way more than I focused on myself. Self-care was not really a thing. Because to me, it was more focusing on everyone else and making sure everyone else was happy and enjoying life. And, growing up, we were homeschooled most of our life too. So that was a different dynamic. Not in a bad way, but it's just different dynamics. So when I hit college, it was another shock.
Right.
And all of a sudden I had this freedom that I never had before. And in that process, because we grew up in a Christian home, we grew up knowing who God was. But I will say that I knew a limited version of who God was. I knew God as, well, if you're walking in the will of God, then everything will be golden
Mm,
gates and wonderful gold path ahead of you. And
mm-hmm.
you will just walk in this amazing journey as long as you're in tune with God.
Mm-hmm.
And I quickly learned that that was not the case.
Mm,
So I went through a couple years of rebellion. I went through a couple years of being like, I really don't want to take that life anymore. I'm going to try this other life.
mm-hmm.
Uh, and in that process, I went through some painful situations. I went through some abuse. I went through some trauma in regards to sexual trauma at one point with
Mm,
a couple individuals. And uh, I began to have these real huge wounds that I really didn't know how to deal with. And so
wow.
instead, codependent self would just stuff them, right? Because it's so much
Mm-hmm.
easier to stuff.
Oh, yes.
Uh,
If I and if I try to keep it in the back of my mind, it won't bother me. Yeah, right.
yes, yes. And eventually, like this body just can't hold it in anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so for a long time, I was like, well, maybe I'll move farther away. Let me see if a new state. When I was young, I was like, well, let's try a new state because, let's try this life somewhere else. And I'm just skimming the surface. There's so many other things that I could
Mm-hmm.
dive into, but for time purpose,
Mm-hmm.
um, we'll just say that there was a lot that we dealt with growing up
Mm-hmm.
in regards to knowing how to know my own identity, knowing how to know a confident version of me,
Right.
knowing how to really take who God is and apply it to my life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I, I,
Knowing when and how to say no.
yes, no with a period, full
Yes.
sentence, stop.
Yes. Yes.
That was not in my vocabulary growing up.
Mm-hmm.
It was always yes, no problem. What would you like?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
You were
and
being
so
obedient.
yes, yes. And so many times that we were told that, that's good. You're supposed to honor your authority and honor who is above you. And I would take things so black and white. Looking at it now, like, man, I was a kid that just saw things as black or white. You're either doing this or you're doing this. Which side are
Mm,
you going to be on today?
right. Right.
Uh, and so I had to recognize that there was a journey in the process, and it's okay to make mistakes, and it's
Mm-hmm.
okay to learn from those mistakes. And uh, I just remember like early in my years, like I had my oldest son when I was 21. And that was like probably my first moment where I felt like I was a failure because growing up in a Christian home, you were told never to have a child out of wedlock. That
Mm-hmm.
was bad,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden I'm in this situation where I thought we were going to have this relationship together and we were going to have our house being built oh, I'm pregnant. Um, and there was some trauma with that too as well. And for purposes of my son, like we'll leave it there,
Mm-hmm.
but there was a lot of trauma with that
Mm-hmm.
just took place prior to when he was born. And all of a sudden I had to recognize that this man that I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with ended up into drugs, ended
Mm.
up totaling my vehicle.
And
And
were you married or you weren't married?
we were ready to be engaged and have a house where we were going
Okay.
to live. So it
Okay.
was like this dream. And
Sure.
looking back, there were promises,
Mm-hmm.
right? And whether that fulfillment would have happened, he wasn't at a point, but at 21, you don't have a wealth of wisdom at that point.
Right. Yes.
uh, you're pulling
Or you
from what
think
you were
you think
promised.
you do and you find out you really didn't.
Yes. My oldest is 22 now, and I laugh because I'm like, wow, I had you at that age. I'm like, wow, I really was not that smart. I'm like, I love you, but like, wow, I was not pulling from a bucket of smartness at all at that point. Uh, but you think like, at that point you're older, and you hear about how your grandparents had kids at like,
Yes.
19, 18,
Yes.
17. So you
16,
think,
some of them.
oh, yeah,
Yes.
you think 21 is not that bad, right?
Right.
Uh, but I recognize in that process, like, there was a moment where we were all ready to buy this house, and I went through a very traumatic delivery with him. I ended up having a staph wound that had to be packed and
Mm,
needed like 24/7 care at that
mm.
point. Um, I went through a C-section where I felt the entire thing because
Oh,
so there was like a lot of levels of trauma that I experienced with that birth even.
right.
Um, and so it was a very interesting process, and even at a young age I was miles away from my parents. My mom suffers from panic attacks where
Mm-hmm.
she physically can't drive.
Mm,
She's been that way since I was 5, and so for me it was just, that's who mom is, right?
right.
uh, but in that moment where you are like, oh my gosh, your state's away, I'm in this traumatic experience and I have no family around me other than you know
You didn't have a
this other
support system.
individual's family. There was no
Right.
support. And I just remember, like, when they finally got the medicine in me, I remember seeing spiders and being like, what is happening to me?
Oh,
Because they had hit the skin instead of a vein. And by the time they
mm,
got to the vein, I had so much medicine in me. I was super happy.
mm-hmm.
Um, but through the process, like, I recognized that the person I was with was really not there. And when I went to go visit my mom, I found out that he was not there at all, that he was cheating on me, and that there was so much other trauma and so much other crisis at that point that all of a sudden my life at that moment crashed. So there was crash number one, we'll
Mm-hmm.
say, where all of a sudden I'm like, oh my goodness, I have this newborn child who's a couple weeks old, and my car is totaled. His dad is at the moment had drugs in my car and possibly has charges.
Oh,
All of my furnishings and everything I've worked for is in the house that I can't really get to, and
mm-hmm.
I'm getting a phone call saying, don't come back, he's been cheating on you. And
Oh,
the woman he cheated was a stripper. That was her profession. And
oh,
she came to the hospital, and I'm like, okay, this is a lot to handle. Let me
yeah.
just process what you just dropped in my lap. um and at that moment, right after delivery, you're not in a state where you can handle
Mm-mm.
uh those kind of atomic bombs, because your emotions are high, your hormones are through the roof, and it took a lot for me to be able to muster up enough strength to say, now what am I going to do?
Right.
um and so at that point I moved back home with my parents, and I got my degree as a paralegal, and I became very self-sufficient, which looking back was not always the best thing, because I just became on airplane mode,
Gotcha.
uh,
You were just going through the
where
motions.
going through the motions, and I was just like, check, took care of him today, check, went to work,
Mm,
check, got this done, check, paid the bills. Um, and meanwhile, shoving every emotion that I've just experienced to the wayside.
mm-hmm.
Uh, and at one point, I remember being like, okay, God, you and me need to have a conversation, because what's happening with my life? Uh,
This is not what
and
I was taught.
this is not what was all like said to me, and this is not that golden path that
No, no.
everybody talks about. Am I out of your will? And if I am, how do I get back on it? And I just remember being like, okay, God, like, we need to figure out this plan. And I am sure God was up there laughing at me, because I'm a planner, and God was like, when you're finished planning, let me know.
Exactly. And then I'll get back to you and I'll let you know what's going to happen.
Yes.
We'll start making the real stuff happen.
And and it's interesting because that atomic bomb I thought I could handle. Growing up, we had next door neighbors that were like our second parents. I lost them quickly within a year of each other.
Mm,
And that was traumatic in high school. I had their nephew was kind of like our cousin, and there was a very traumatic experience where he was killed due to a gang situation. And I thought, those were difficult. But
Right.
when this happened, I was like, "Whoa, this is a lot harder to deal with."
Mm-hmm.
And how do I get on this airplane mode and just survive?
Right.
Because at that point, you're like trying to figure out what is it that I need to do to just survive. And in that process, my parents watched my son as I went to the work and went to school and got to a place where I could be functional. But I remember telling God, okay, God, I'm signing off from men. No more, done, got this child, I'm gonna play the parent role, and I'm just gonna sign off from men.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a sense of humor that's kind of funny, because he's like, do you really want to sign off for men? Let's see if that's really the case, because we're just going to allow these testings to happen to see if you really mean what you say.
Right. Right.
uh and in that process, like, I remember getting so many asks of dates,
Oh.
um and I was like, what's happening? And I just like took it as, oh, this is kind of nice, this feels great. But then I was like, no, I don't really want to go on dates. I told God no. But then there was a situation where, like, or a person I worked with, she knew me from high school, and she was just like, my cousin would be perfect for you. And I said, okay, well, this is somebody I know. Um, and I remember by the time he showed up, there were so many promises. Gonna show up, gonna show up, gonna show up. By the time he showed up, I was sick. I was wearing a sweatshirt to work. I probably had sweaty armpits. I was like disgusting mess. And he shows up to work and is like, do you want to go on a date? And I'm like, really? Like the way I look today?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, God, this must be it. I'll try it. And I remember learning that he went to church. And so for me, checkbox,
Right.
Christian, done. We're going to be equally yoked at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I was like, okay, this is it. This must be God's moment.
This is where the good
And
stuff starts happening.
yeah. And I was just like, okay. He loves, he went to church. He was brought up in the church. His dad's an organist. Like, this is it. And I remember we dated for about a year, and then he proposed. And we ended up getting married, and later on had three more kids. So at this
Mm-hmm.
point, now four. And he took in my oldest as his own, and it seemed beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Everything seemed great. And there were moments we all had, anytime in marriage, you're going to have your challenges, you're going to have your
Right.
struggles.
Life happens.
We, yeah. And at that point, we had to reinvent ourselves. He was a personal trainer, and not really, he was in and out of people's homes, but like a clients here and there. And it was really just my income that was like providing at that point. And I was like, we really need to make this work. So I became a nutrition coach at one point, when the kids, once we had all four kids, I was like, I'll be a nutrition coach, you be the personal trainer, and we'll own gyms.
Mm.
That will work. And so me and my business brain and being a paralegal, I was like, we'll draft up all the paperwork and we'll make it work. And I was like, I'll learn marketing and I'll learn all this, and I just became this like individual that was like, again, self-sufficient in another
Mm-hmm.
area, in
Mm-hmm.
airplane mode. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, we're just going to fix all our problems financially, and we'll own all this amazing empire that will pass on to our children. And
That's
our
your goal.
marriage
There's your
was,
golden path, right?
yes, the golden path. And I just remember, like, the marriage seemed awesome. We did everything together. We would go on vacations, and from the outside, people were like, wow, this is a beautiful marriage. They love each other. But then we would come home and we'd have some real battles. His parents were separated, and they
Mm.
lived close by, and my parents were close by, and there was a lot of tension of where we were going to go and who was going to be able to see us at that time and that place. And there
Mm-hmm.
was just a lot of fighting over, you know, whose parents are we going to today?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and which one wins? Let's draw out of
Right.
a hat,
Right. Right.
And we recognize too that, looking back, I see where our communication was not great.
Mm.
It seemed great in the moment, but it wasn't. He stuffed and brushed under the bed, and I would just be like, let's figure out a plan. And so the two don't really mix very well because he would just shut down and I would be like the talker and be like,
Mm-hmm.
let's figure this out. Here's a plan. Does this work? Does this look good? Uh, and so the communication was like a lot of times one way, and then he would blow. Um, and so recognizing that like there was a lot of work
Right.
and neither of us really saw it enough to be able to really dive in and say, okay, we really need to do this and we need to work on this. And in all honesty, we were both coming in with our own experiences growing up and thinking that that was going to work,
Right.
thinking that what we were brought up was the right way to be brought up. And so we would have these arguments over like silly things now looking back at it. Um, and then there was like a lot of verbal abuse that would happen because when he would get mad, it was verbal. A lot of it was negative thought process and negative comments that would just fester. And I've dealt with physical abuse from previous, earlier on, and I will say from my experience, like so much easier to heal from those physical wounds than it is to heal from the mental
Oh,
thought process wounds.
what an interesting observation. Wow.
Yeah, because they're invisible, right? Like
Right, right,
others
right.
don't see them, and you can stuff them for a really long time, and you can pretend like and compartmentalize them and put them on the storage and be like, I'll deal with that later.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's a wound that I don't want to touch today.
Right.
Uh, where the physical wounds you have to deal with, they're visible. You
Yes.
have to see them, you have to deal with them,
And you don't
and
want
you
other people to see them either.
yes, so you want to cover them up quickly and deal
Mm-hmm.
with them quickly so they disappear.
Right.
You can't really hide them in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so I recognized real quickly how easy it was to deal with physical wounds versus emotional wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, because I was codependent, I just wanted to please my husband. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, I would shove all the negative thoughts and I wouldn't process them. And in time, what I did was I welcomed all those negative thoughts and said, "Come on into my brain, come take a seat, sit here for a while,
Find a
and
spot, get comfortable.
yep, enjoy and rent some space in my brain and have fun." Create some havoc and be okay with it
Uh-huh.
because I'm letting you in today.
Right.
Uh, and it's a slow process too. When you're dealing with verbal abuse, when you're dealing with emotional abuse, it's a slow process where it
Mm-hmm.
creeps up on you and you don't recognize the full brunt of it until you've had enough.
Right.
Um, and I just know that like through my marriage, I never really saw it in that way.
Mm.
Other people would say, wow, you're okay with him saying that? And I'd be like, what do you mean? Because I didn't want to deal with it at that point.
Right. Right.
I was just like, no, he's good. He's good. And I would defend him.
Right.
And I would find ways to be able to do so, or I would start to condone it and say, well, I probably was the reason. I wasn't communicating enough, or I wasn't doing,
You were making
X, Y, or
excuses
Z.
for him.
Yeah. And so, in that trauma state, you don't recognize it and you don't deal with it. And if you don't have the good support system in that process to be able to surround you and hold you accountable and really open those wounds up and say, no, you need to deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
It's, having that intervention, having those moments to say, no, you're not okay.
Right.
This is going to affect you this way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's hard. My mom tried for a while, but having somebody close to you like that, it's tough
Right.
because as a parent, when you're 35, 30 years old, like you don't want to hear from your parents that you made the wrong decision.
Exactly.
Uh, and so it
And
really
their
needs to
thinking
be
is not
someone
going to,
else.
their thinking and advice is not going to be very rational because it's going to be very one-sided because you are their
Yes.
child and they're wanting the best for you, but yet it's still not going to be the advice or information or resource that you need.
Yes. And so I again went on airplane mode and in all honesty, like I just numbed myself and basically went into a mode where I just took care of the kids and him and made sure that they were all happy.
And
While on a
forgot about
daily
yourself.
basis, mhm, I was depleted on a daily basis. I was that car that had no gas in it at all times.
So you were just pushing
And
the car.
yes, I was pushing the car. And after a while, it got pretty heavy. And but I would always tell myself, oh, no, this is just how marriage is. Marriage is just a process where fighting is okay. I grew up where my dad and mom would get in fights all the time and verbal fights. So for me, it was comfortable. It was normal. Like
Hmm.
they're just having discussions, like they're
Hmm.
fighting about something, and that's just normal to have in a relationship when you're married.
Right.
uh and again, it goes back to what you were brought up with, right? And what you witnessed as a child and what you saw as the norm.
It sets your
um
standard. It's the expectation.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, wow, I look back now and I'm like, man, if I had had somebody else just come in and say, Tara, wake up,
Hmm.
you are not in a healthy relationship. And it's hard too, because growing up in a Christian home, like, the thoughts in my head were, I can't get divorced because it's against God. I
Right.
can't leave this man. So I just need to make this relationship better. How can
Hmm.
I do that? Let me figure out what he loves to do, what he loves to be able, what makes him happy, and let me figure out a way to just make him happy all the time.
Because if he's happy, then that'll make me happy.
Yes. And it was hard because there was some abuse that happened with my oldest. And uh looking back, I recognize how I just turned a blind eye because I didn't want to cause more tension in our
Hmm.
marriage,
Hmm.
and I didn't want to turn the flashlight on to myself, which was such a selfish move as a mom. And but it was like at a point where I was just like, no, we're finally okay. Like, why? It's just his parenting style. I come up with another excuse. Oh,
Right.
he's Irish and German. That's just the way it is. Like, short temper, poke out the ears, here we come. And I would figure out ways. I remember one time, like, my children, they had this beautiful house upstairs, or beautiful room upstairs. My two boys, they're 17 months apart, and they were like thing one and thing two. And I just remember we had like a reading tent with this huge rope that we hung from the ceiling, and we had the train table with the two beds. And I remember one day I was downstairs, I was in the kitchen doing something, and all of a sudden I hear crash and then silence. And I'm like, I go upstairs. Do I even like check to see what's going on? I'm like, this is not good. And I run upstairs, and there one's hanging from the ceiling with this hole in the ceiling,
Oh,
because the ceiling tent literally came out of the ceiling as he's hanging. And the
oh,
other one's hanging from the blade of the fan,
oh my
uh,
gosh.
as the train table's underneath them. And they're both like, Mom, we're Tarzan. And I'm like, well. But I remember in my head going, oh my gosh, we have to hurry up and fix this before your dad gets home because he's going to throw a fit.
Hmm.
And so I easily became this like fix it woman. Like, I just became really handy, really quick. Um, I remember our next door neighbor were retired teachers, and for Christmas they gave me the fix it handbook. Not
Oh,
my husband, they gave me,
they
and they
give
were
it to
like, "Well,
you.
Tara learns how to fix everything," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's only because I'm trying to make sure to like reduce the tension in the house."
Right.
And they had no clue. They just saw
Right.
it as, oh, she just knows how to fix everything.
Right.
And so I just recognized, like, from the outside, our marriage looked really good. We owned three gyms. I had a nutrition practice. He had a personal training practice. We also had a nonprofit that was under my name, that where we taught kids how to cook healthy. And so it looked like we were building this amazing life,
Hmm.
that we would be able to continue forward with. And we had just purchased, or just took over the third gym, which was a brand new gym that we gutted from beginning to end. And we just remodeled our house at that point. And I remember getting ready that September to take my children to orientation for school. And I remember getting in the car with them, and my husband at the time came to my window and said, "We really need to talk, and I need to tell you something right now." And I'm like, "Well, can I drop the kids off and then we can talk?" Or he goes, "Nope, I'm just going to tell you right now." And he's like, "I'm leaving you for your best friend, and I want a divorce."
Uh,
And I just remember being like, "You're joking," because he liked to joke a lot. And so I'm like, "You're
oh,
just joking."
whoa.
And so that was like crash number two. But
Oh
to
my
me, that was
gosh.
the tidal wave that just made me collapse. Because at that point, everything I had worked for, uh, and I say I, because at that point I was like so focused on what could I do in life. I had kind of put God on the back burner. I my entire life was very self-focused at that point. I was a toothpick, like serious toothpick, because
Mm.
we own gyms and I just worked out a lot. Um, and I just remember at that point being like, oh no, he's not joking. And I remember just tears flowing because this family we had connected with. She had 5 kids in the same school district, and we had 4. They were all best friends. We used to have dinners together at least 2 to 3 times a week,
Oh,
and we would share meals together. I had a couple days right before had went to her birthday party and made sure she had went to bed uh, without um without being unsafe because she had drank for her birthday. And I remember sleeping in the same bed, making sure she was still breathing all night. And I used
so
to watch her.
there was no clue, no warning sign, no anything.
Nothing. We used to hang out and we would all have fun. And they had a pool in the backyard. The kids would all play and they would swim. And
Wow.
they had a huge backyard, and we would all just hang out, and we would have other families come as well. And so to all of us, we all had great families that all connected and all had wonderful meals together and times together where we got to socialize. And there were moments, there was a lot of alcohol at these parties, and that was not kind of my thing at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up with my dad, who does drink, like, it just was not something
Mm-hmm.
um that was huge for me. Parties were not huge. Growing up with I have a lot of um experience even with my oldest son's dad, who was in addiction. Like, I just didn't want to be around that much.
Right.
So I kind of would just kind of be off to the side, but like we still connected. We all went on women's parties together, and the men would go off and do their card games. And it was that like picturesque movie
Mm-hmm.
um type of experience where life seemed great. It was that golden road that I learned about growing up, and I was like, oh, I must be just living this great life. And so in that moment when that happened, I was like broken. Um, I was in shock. I was numb. I felt so many emotions flooding. It was like a tidal wave, and everything I had put on the shelf or stuffed jumped aboard.
Sure.
And so I got like double everything from wave one and now wave two.
Mm-mm.
Uh, And I just remember looking at him, and I couldn't even hear the rest of his conversation because I was crying so much. And I
Right.
just remember driving away. And I remember being like, I'm just going to drive. I'm just going to drive. I'm going to continue to drive until all of this goes away.
And you're
Because
in
how am I
shock.
going to pick all these pieces? Yeah, complete shock. Like, I couldn't even like I look back and I thank God that I'm still alive, because the amount of tears that came out of my eyes that night, I don't even remember where I drove. And when I got home, I don't even know how I got home safe
Mm.
from driving, because I was such a mess in the car.
Yeah.
Um and I was on all these back roads, and I just remember being like, wow, how did I even make it on that road okay
Mm-hmm.
in that state? Because I was literally numb. And I remember
Mm.
walking in the door and I remember him pulling me into the bedroom and being like, you can't tell anybody. So not only did I just have this huge atomic bomb go off in my life, and everything that I thought was stable was now gone, and unstable. He's now telling me I can't share it with anyone. And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, well, we have to figure out how we're going to tell the kids. And you have the 5 kids and our 4 kids, and they all go to school together, and we just got to figure this out. And so I'm like, okay, but what about like internally? I'm like, what about me? Like, how am I
Exactly.
supposed to figure it out?
Yes.
Uh, but I didn't express that, because I naturally love to stuff things and fix things. And so, and I'm the yes girl, not the no girl,
Mm-hmm.
and setting boundaries at that point. And so I really just became numb to the world in general. My daughter was young at that point. We had 3 boys, and my youngest was a daughter, and we finally had a girl. And I was going to be home with her, and I was ecstatic. And now all of a sudden, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to experience this.
No.
So the losses were multiple.
Right.
uh the loss of the business, I'm like, what about the business? Because in my head I'm going, what about the business, what about the children, what about all of our assets, what about all these other things? And meanwhile he's off wanting to separate not only our family but another family
Mm.
who also owned businesses. And I just remember at that point really struggling.
The
uh
the ripple effect is phenomenal.
yeah,
I
it
mean, how
it
many people are affected by their choice, and all the people affected by that?
yeah. And it was hard because I'm sitting there going, wow, we live in a small community. Because at that point we lived in upstate New York, in the Finger Lakes area, and it was small. The town that we lived in was small, and everybody knew everybody. and
Mm.
and both families owned businesses, so they both knew us in the community as business owners.
Wow.
um and they knew our kids based on the business. And I'm like, wow, what is this going to look like? And meanwhile, I'm trying to plan and I can't think of a plan. At this point, it was the first time in my life that I physically couldn't put together a plan. And I was like, what am I supposed to do now? And I just remember the kids were in school at that point, and my daughter was in preschool, I think, at that point, or home. She was super young, super, super young. Maybe a little over a year, 2 years old, super young. And I just remember putting the boys on the bus, like as if it was like a natural motion, but like I was out of my body watching it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I would crawl right back into bed and sleep the rest of the day. I wouldn't eat anything. I'd barely drink enough water. And in 2 months' time, I lost 100 pounds.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, people were like, what diet program are you on? Because remember, we own gyms. And so people are like, I love the way you look. What diet
Oh,
program are you on? And meanwhile, I'm bitter and I'm angry and I'm hurt. And I just remember looking at them and being like, how dare you? Like, don't ask me that question. This is not a diet program you want. It's
no.
not some pill I'm taking. It's not some like wonderful, slushy or smoothie, or, it's not
Mm-hmm.
some wonderful like food that I have shipped to my house. Like,
Right.
if you knew really what was happening behind the scenes, you wouldn't want this.
No.
Uh, and I just remember going to a play and a mom coming up to me and being like, she made a big deal about it. And I almost lashed out at her. And at that point, I would always wear everything on my face. And I remember getting in the car and my kids were like, Mom, you almost like you almost lost it on her.
Mm.
And I
They
was
saw
like,
it.
I did. I was like, oh. Um, and at that point was I began to wake up, because before that I was suicidal.
Oh,
Before that I was severely depressed. Before that I was at a point, I remember telling God at one point, if this is it, God, just just make it quick.
So
Because
your children were noticing
yeah,
and you had
because
no idea.
I would sit and buy dinner, have it made, put it out on a nice platter to make it look like I made dinner for the night, and I go back into bed.
Wow.
And I would check all the boxes so it looked like the house was clean, looked like the dinner was made, looked like everything was normal, but I would spend my entire day sleeping.
Wow.
Um, and people would call me, and I just remember at that time, like my sister was going through a divorce at that time, so she was calling, and she experienced a lot of trauma in her divorce. And I remember listening to her story and just being like, I don't want to hear it right now.
Right.
I just don't want to hear what you're going through because I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't talk about what I was going through.
Right.
Uh, and the only person I could talk to was the girl that my husband at the time wanted to leave me for, and it was her husband. And thank gosh, God is awesome. He made sure he was an awesome cook. He was a chef in his career, and I was like, thank you, Jesus. At least I have good food. Uh, and I got, he just cooked and cooked and cooked and cooked. We had so many amazing meals, and we would just watch TV and we would cry.
Mm-hmm. So in
But
the
it got to
meantime, so in the meantime, did your husband and his wife then, did they move in together then, or?
So when he told me the next day, he packed his stuff and he started living at his parents' house, but he would come back after the kids got home from school and he would stay overnight with from there until the next morning. But when the
Okay.
kids were at school and he was at work, he was living somewhere else.
Gotcha.
Um, and it was tough because the kids started asking, "Where's dad?
Mm-hmm.
Where is he? Why is he gone all the time? He's gone way more. He's not letting us go with him to work because when he would personal train, he would take them with him
Mm-hmm.
at times and they would exercise on the equipment and they'd have that like bonding time. And
Right.
that wasn't happening anymore.
Right.
Um, and so they began to start asking questions and I was like, no. After a while, I was like, this is awful because I'm lying to my children.
Mm-hmm.
um, I remember there was a one point where my where the woman he married and my husband at the time wanted to meet. And the fixer that I am was like, yes, this is my opportunity to fix this solution. Let's use persuasive conversations and figure out a way to fix this solution. And in the process, I remember we were counsel. I said, I had told my husband at the time, I said, if you really want to do this, we have to at least counsel. You have to be willing to go through counseling for at least to see if it's fixable. If it's not, then I'll wash my hands of it and you can go your way.
Mm-hmm.
And he agreed at the time. So he was counseling. She came over to the house, and I just remember sitting at the dining room table and they were sitting next to each other. And I just remember her saying, "Can we still be friends?"
Oh my gosh.
And I just
Oh.
remember being like, "Really?" And they were like, "Well, aren't you going to stay here? We'll be able to like get the kids close and we'll switch the kids back and forth." Um, and looking back at it, Andrew's parents went through a very similar situation. His mom chose to leave very similarly. And so, in the moment of loss, in the moment of despair, you don't think about those situations, right? You don't think
Right.
about what have they been through and why do they see it as normal? Why do they see it as okay? Um, my parents, on the other hand, fought like cats and they fought all the time, but they stuck together. And man, like they're still married to this day. Uh, and their
They were
relationship
they
is
were they were
better.
releasing all of that stuff. They weren't stuffing it.
Yeah. And so I'm just like, I don't understand you. But I remember them saying, we were only maybe 2 or 3 miles away from each other. Um, as far as houses wise. And so in their eyes, we would just be this happy family where the children would just bounce from house to house. And I remember, even now, like looking back, um, I recognize how powerful words are because I remember my husband at the time and um, joking about how the kids looked so similar, and how they could be siblings before I found out. And so I recognize that those words are powerful. But
Yes.
in that moment of despair, you don't, it's hard to think of all those things. But as you begin to heal, you start to recognize the power of words, the power of being able to say no, and what that does to a situation, boundaries. There's so much. And I just remember in the counseling session, I remember being like, okay, this is going to be it. This is where I'm going to get validated. And in all honesty, I learned more about who he was. I
Mm.
learned that the counselor at that time was like working through stuff. And I just remember him at the very end leaving and saying, I'm done. I'm done with this. It's always, I'm not getting my way. She's getting her way. I'm done. And he walked out of the counseling session. And I remember looking at the counselor and being like, now what? Like, what am I going to do now? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this was the last straw. Um, and she gave me some very wise words of wisdom. And she was like, you need to join a battered women's shelter center for support. She's
Mm.
like, because you are dealing with someone who's very narcissistic. And
Mm.
she's like, and he's somebody that I've seen. She goes, I haven't seen someone to that extent in a while. She's like, you're gonna have a journey ahead of you. And she's
Wow.
like, you're gonna have to dig deep. And she's like, you're gonna have to hold on even when it's tough. And I just remember those words being ringing in my ear because I was like, she basically told me that this atomic bomb is going to get worse.
Right.
And
Right.
I
It's
was
like,
like,
how can it?
worse? How can it get any worse than this?
Right.
I'm like, oh my gosh. But she was right. Because in that next, I would say 2 years, um, we went through a court battle that I would never wish upon anybody.
Mm.
Um, and there were times where like, we tried the way where we would just do it or do the decree through the attorneys. And so
Mm-hmm.
we had one paper that basically said, okay, here's our agreement. But we got to the point of signing, and all of a sudden he would bring in another court case, and all of a sudden, so now we had this family court case. And I remember at that point, I was going to the abuse center, and the abuse center was saying, Tara, like, you got to learn boundaries and fast. And they're
Whoa.
like, and you need distance right now while you heal. You need distance while you pull the pieces together and deal with it. And at that point, when we were going through family court, I found out that the three businesses we had, he had walked away from.
Mm.
And it wasn't enough time where I could take the equipment that we owned out of it and sell it. They had already gotten rid of it.
Oh my gosh.
So everything that we had built financially was gone.
Mm.
And in the process, he lets me know that he filed bankruptcy.
Mm.
So everything debt wise for the house remodel, for the businesses, was now financially on me. And when I say a financial tidal wave, it was like, I mean, we're talking like I could have paid a house in cash. And I
Mm.
just remember being like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with now
Mm-hmm.
this? And I
Mm-hmm.
remember that counselor's advice. And I was like, oh, this is the tough part that she was talking about.
Right.
And I just remember him being like, nope, you can have the house that I couldn't afford because couldn't I couldn't take the businesses. Uh, my practice at that time was not built enough where I could just move into that on my own. And everything that I had, the paralegal work, everything what I had left when the children were young, because
Mm-hmm.
we wanted a place where I could be home with them and be
Right.
able to nurture them. And so I'm like, oh my goodness, I have to reinvent myself again. And
Next
I
round.
just, yeah, and I just remember being like, oh my gosh, this is like hitting tidal wave after tidal wave. Um, and that moment where I was in bed prior to all this, where I was suicidal, I was yet suicidal again because I
Mm,
felt like, how am I ever going to get out of this pit
right.
that just keeps shoving me deeper, that keeps shoving me down even further? And I feel like any glimpse of light that I see is gone. Attorney fees were out of the wazoo, and it was scary. I will say I was fearful. I was in a place of like desolation. I was desperate. My parents were trying to help, but it wasn't really help because it was like it was so overwhelming. It was difficult to hear from people close to you, to be able
Did
to receive the help.
did you find during this time that you were actually mad at God?
Oh, I was so mad at God. I remember running right after he had told me the kids would go to school, and probably about 2 months after, when I people thought I was on the diet program, when I finally mustered the strength, because at one point I was like, God, this is it. And I remember hearing God in some sense be like, this is not it.
Mm.
And I remember being like, okay, I got to do something. And so I just started running. And running went from 1 miles to 2 miles, and it ended up 15 miles a day. I would
Oh
just
my
put tunes in
gosh.
my ear and I would just run everything off. And
Wow.
running became an addiction for me because I just wanted so badly to run from my life. I wanted to run from the problems. I wanted to run from everything that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I wanted to run in shame and guilt because now every problem that I couldn't fix was now going to be exposed to this community. Um, and I just remember being like, man, I just want to run. And I would just run, 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 run. And I come back. And so for me, addiction turned into coffee and running
Mm.
and this place of like isolation. That was another addiction movement for me, and behavior wise, because for me it was, I'm just going to isolate myself. I'm going to put a fake smile on, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to be okay. But in the quiet time I'd be like, God, I really feel like you left me. I
Right.
really am mad at you. I'm
Right.
angry of where I'm at. But I will tell you, in those moments, that's when God spoke to me the most.
Mm-hmm.
Because God wants us to be so honest and real with Him.
Right.
God already knows our emotions before we have them. And
Yes.
so that's where God wanted me to get to, because He couldn't do anything until I surrendered. And that meant
Exactly.
surrendering my emotions. And so at that point, like when I would run, God would just speak, and I would cry, and God would speak more, and I would cry,
Mm-hmm.
and God would give me these awesome like journal moments where I would just journal with God, and I became so hungry for more of that.
Mm.
Um, and God would just constantly tell me, trust me, keep pushing. I have more for you. This is not your end all.
Mm-hmm.
I'm building you for something greater. I
Wow.
need to sever this because it can't give me glory.
Mm-hmm.
I've waited too long for him to turn. Now it's time for you to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows me because I would have fought tooth and nail like I tried.
Mm-hmm.
Knows I would have fixed it some way, shape, or form if I could have. Um,
But you also
and so
know
God
that
was
you
like, I'm
you
gonna,
were putting in some effort to try to make it work. So it's not like you just said, "Yep, okay, bye, see ya." I mean, you tried.
yeah. oh man, I tried to grip onto my husband at the time with like white knuckles and was
Mm-hmm.
like, the girl was like, oh my gosh, don't leave me. I was like brutally like, snot and the whole nine works, like when all that went through.
You
But
you had to become on your knees, and then
yeah,
God said, "Okay, here we go."
yeah, yeah. God needed me so broken, and I thought I was broken, but I wasn't, because I was so self-sufficient, which is pride.
Right,
And God knew that if I wanted to stay in that place of pride, he couldn't use me.
right, right.
Um, and so he needed that pride broken in order to be moldable and usable. And so he waited until I was like the exerciser bunny, just finally depleted
That
and
battery ran
ran
down.
myself. Yep. And then God was like, good, the battery's out. Now I can deal with you.
Now I can mold you.
Yes. And it's beautiful because in those moments, I would journal, and I would encourage anyone going through a moment like that to journal, because that scripture in Habakkuk 2 is so real to me, because God tells us to write things down plain and clear. And
Mm,
it might not be for this time, it might
mm-hmm.
be for your future date.
Right.
And there is so much of where I was going to, of today, of the journey through the divorce, that I needed to write down. So when I got to the point, I could read back through those journal moments and say, okay, yes, I'm going to make it through. God promised me this.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And you
and
could
I
see
will
your
say that
growth
was,
and the progress that you've been making as well.
yeah. I mean, it was a journey. At that time, there was a lot of more verbal abuse. I called it, I got books in text, the texts that
Mm-hmm.
were like X long, and they were tactful. And I just remember like reading them and feeling so guilty and so shameful. And I'd be like, God, why do I feel this way when I've done nothing wrong? I
Mm-hmm.
didn't sever this marriage. I didn't decide to end this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember the moment where we had to finally tell my children. And it was at a point of desperation because I was so sick of lying to them. And I remember we were in the house, and my husband at the time was ready to pack his bags again and head for his parents' house, which I knew was meant that him and her were gonna be together, and I was gonna have to deal with the kids. And I remember him coming down the hall, and I stopped him and I said, please, we either have to figure out something or we have to tell the kids. And I said, and you can't leave until we figure this out. And I remember him getting so mad that he raised a fist.
Oh.
And I remember that fist. And it was like at the point where I was like, oh, here we go. Okay, this is serious. He really does not want to work through this. And I said, if you leave tonight, I'm telling the kids, your bags will be packed on the front porch. This will be done. And you will have what you want. And sorry, I got dry throat. Um, I just remember him being like, fine, whatever. And he pushed through me. And I remember my children were on the couch and they were like, where's dad going? And so when he left, I packed the bags and I walked out and put them on the front porch. um, and I remember him leaving at the time. And I walked back in, and all four of my children's eyes are looking at me. And they're like, what's happening? And at that point, I was like, God, give me the strength, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have to share with my children and shatter their lives,
Mm-hmm.
shatter their comfort zone, shatter their security, shatter everything that they knew was safe, all by myself.
Right.
Um, And so I went and told them, and I probably didn't do it in the best way, but I did it out of fear. I
Mm-hmm.
just did it scared,
Mm-hmm.
because there was no easy way to be able to do that. And I remember them crying and not sure, very distraught, very upset of what was going to take place. They couldn't understand what was happening. They were angry. But I just remember such a relief that I was finally able to share it with somebody.
Right.
I
It was
finally
out.
could no longer have this secret shoved inside of me, and I was doing it all on my own.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in that moment, that's when I felt like things started, even though they weren't easy, they were easier because I wasn't doing it all by myself anymore. I
Right.
wasn't having to put on this fake smile. I wasn't have to be put on, and this was months. Um, I remember at that time I had to sell the house we were in because I couldn't afford it. And I had to
Mm-hmm.
move into apartments. So the kids had to move into another change. We moved into a new school district because the apartment was out of the school district. So it was another change for the kids. And at this point, they're going back and forth and they're not really sure. They're very confused as to how that's going to work with their friends and what that's going to look like when kids see them in school. And so it was not only dealing with my own emotions, but now I'm having to help my children
Right. It's not just about you
through
anymore,
this.
huh?
Right. And so it was like another level. And at this point, we were going through family court, and I just remember God saying, I need you to move. And I thought, at this point, we had moved out of the school district. I thought that was a move. It was
Mm-hmm.
like 20 minutes away. I thought that's a move. But God just kept saying, you need to move. And I remember in one of my journal entries, God was sharing with me, I need you to move far away. I'm calling you and your children to walk out of the Red Sea. And when you do, everything you've experienced will be no more.
Wow.
And I remember writing that down in my journal entry, and I'm like, well, that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I remember being like, okay. And at that point, I was reading the Prayer Circle book by Mark Batterson, and I'm on this like prayer hype, right? I'm like, okay, God, I'm bringing you all my prayers and I'm putting circles around them and I'm making declarations and this is what's going to take place. And I was working at the ski resort. My children loved that job because they could ski and they could go to the water park. And so on our end, life seemed okay other than the bills, right? Like
Right.
I was pinching pennies for a while. Uh, but I remember I needed to move. And the counseling office and the battered women's office I was in, I remember going in to talk with my caseworker at the time, and she looked at me and she goes, Tara, I'm going to be honest with you. You really need to move and far away. She goes, I mean like 2 to 3 hours far away.
So now she's saying it.
And so now she's saying it. And I'm like, but that's scary. One, my mom doesn't travel. So she's not going to be able to see the kids anymore because 3 hours is too far for her to travel.
Mm-hmm.
Two, like I don't have any support system 3 hours away. Like 3 hours away to me at that point was Pennsylvania, New York City,
Mm-hmm.
Buffalo, Albany.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm like, I don't know anybody in those areas. Um, but I remember being on such a high with God at that point, reading that book, that at the end of that book, Mark Batterson says, if you're like basically, if you are daring enough, then use these words. And I remember just being in a place of desperation again with God and saying, God, use me, show me, and send me. Now, if
Mm-hmm.
you're ever going to use those words, you better make sure what the power of those words really mean because they're powerful words. Um, because I didn't realize what they really meant. And through the process, I started to be like, okay, God, I'm going to put you to the test. And I put a 3 hour radius around Ithaca at the time. That's where we lived. And everything, every single job I applied to, and I applied to so many, every job came to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And I'm like, God, well, Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania is like so, like, I've driven through it and it's boring. I'm just being real with you, God, but it's boring. I'm like, there's really nothing there. And Wilkes-Barre, God, like, okay, but like, what's there?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I just remember hearing God say, trust me, I need you to go to this area.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, God, you know best. I'm going to put you to the test again. If this is where you want me to go, then give me a house, give me uh, a place to, or give me a job, and
Mm-hmm.
give me my children to go with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so one weekend, I had 2 job offers.
Oh man, there you go.
And I'm just like, wow. I'm like, okay, God, that's right. You are the God of the impossibility. Like you can
Mm-hmm.
do all things. And at this point, I'm still broken and I'm still going through a lot of pain, but I've started to see a glimpse of hope because I'm watching God do some big things that I couldn't see anyone else do in my life.
Right.
And I'm watching things line up to what God was telling me. And for the first time in my life, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm actually hearing God.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that without God, you won't get through your struggles.
You were
You won't
open
get
to receiving the
mm-hmm.
information.
Because God will protect you, but you need God more than anything else. Because
Mm-hmm.
God's your driver. And if
Mm-hmm.
you don't put God in that driving seat with you and you don't, sit and enjoy the
Mm-hmm.
journey with him, your journey's going to be a hot mess.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember having a dream of this house and feeding people. And when they left, they were well. They were great. They were wonderful. But when they came in, they were broken. And I just at that point was like, oh, that's kind of like me in my situation. And that must be what I'm going through because I just remember God saying, I have so much more for you. I have so much more for you.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the things I would hold on to because those were the nuggets of good that I could hold on to amidst all the shatter. And when I went down for the 2 job offers, I'm like, let's just look for housing. Let's see what options there are.
Right.
And God is super cool because I looked on Craigslist and the exact house that was in my dream was on Craigslist for rent.
Oh.
And I'm just like, wow, God, like, okay, you are so loud and clear. I can't dispute it. Like, there's nothing that I can do that can say that this is not you, God.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I chose. I was like, okay, God, you have one thing left, and you got a big one. You got my ex to be able to convince for my kids to come with me. And my kids were still broken at that point. We did a lot of art together. We did a lot of dinner table talks together. My kids were broken.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my one son just being like, I want it all to go back to normal.
Right.
Um, and so I asked them, I said, if we move, do you want to go with me? And my kids at that point were like, yes, I want to go with you. Um, and
Another
so
blessing.
I emailed him at that time and was like, I'm moving. This job opportunity is something I can't pass up, and I need your permission. And we did it through attorneys, and he agreed. And I'm like, okay, God, this is it.
Mm.
And I packed my bags and I packed everything in the house. And a week before I was ready to move, he took me to Supreme Court and filed for the kids.
Oh.
And so we are on crash number 3 at that point. And so I ended up having to move at that point because I knew what God told me, which I knew at that point I couldn't leave God because God was the only rock I had at that point in my journey. And so I
Mm-hmm.
clung to God and was like, God, you're going to have to figure this out. But I was broken. So I moved without my kids.
In some
I was
respects,
both,
it's almost like your ex-husband was Satan because God does not like, I mean, Satan does not like it when you're now communicating faithfully with God, and so he's using your ex in every way possible for you to go back to
yes.
doubting and not believing in God.
Yeah, I mean, there was one moment I remember right before I left, the apartment was all packed up in boxes, and the moving truck was outside, ready to be packed the next day, and the law guardian had to come to meet with my children for the first time, and she wouldn't let me in the room. She had to do everything separate, and
Mm,
I just felt like it was such a weird situation, and that day or that week when we had to go to court, I spent the entire day on the stand, and they just attacked me. Like, I remember I was attacked from the area, from the angle of the law guardian saying my house was condemned because there was no toys in it, but they were all packed in boxes.
right.
Um, to my my husband at the time, his mom getting on the stand and saying that my children's behavior had nothing to do with my ability to parent, but all my husband's at the time, and that I was never in the picture. And I'm like, whoa, where are all these lies coming from?
Yep.
And meanwhile, I had to pay for expert witnesses to come in and prove that these were lies. And
Mm,
and even with these lies, to move out of state, you had to meet that the school district was better, the housing situation was better, and that your job was better situation financially. And I thought everything was great because I took this job and I was making two times what I was making in New York. The house was this amazing three-bedroom house with a backyard that was fenced in, and a community that was beautiful, and a playground in the backyard, um, and the area was a booming area,
mm-hmm,
with low crime rate. And so I'm like, oh, slam dunk, got it.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Paralegal in me was like, yes,
mm-hmm.
I've met all the marks and I'm done. Um, and I just remember being on the stand, and I remember hearing the words, but your job is commission based. And so we can't count it.
Oh,
And I remember at the time being like, wait, what? Why wasn't this brought up? And I remember hearing, so many attacks. Uh, and they were just like false attacks, like false lies about, she never picks them up from school, but then he wouldn't pick them up. And I would bring, like, someone from the daycare to like validate that I was the one that would answer the phone, and he wouldn't. He was too busy, and
mm-hmm,
he would tell them, nope, that's Tara's turn. Tara has to call. You have to call
mm-hmm,
Tara.
mm-hmm,
Um, and I was like, God, this is like a lot of lies. I felt like David at the moment, my
mm-hmm,
enemies were coming at me,
mm-hmm.
and everything that was happening was like out of my control, and I wasn't doing anything for the attack.
Right.
I was innocent in that aspect. Um, and I remember the judge pulling me in the office at the very end. He goes, I need to meet with you in the chambers.
Mm,
And I was like, why does the judge want to meet with just me? And he looked at me and he goes, I need you to hear this from me first before I make my decision. He's like, but I can't send kids with you because you didn't meet the financial part because of your commission job. He goes, but I'm going to sock it to him financially, and I'm going to make
mm,
him pay you money in all these other areas. He goes, with the hopes that, he will recognize he's made the wrong decision, because I
mm,
see that the kids need you, and I want to give you the kids, but I can't because of legally, this is what I
mm.
have to follow. And I remember hearing him, but I wasn't hearing him. It was
Right.
like, again, I was numb. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, wait, I've moved to Pennsylvania. I've followed God. I've obeyed God's every command. And again, I was at a place with God being like, God, what did I do wrong? And I remember being broken at that point again. And my
Right.
oldest came to live with me, because at that point he didn't want anything to do with my oldest. He completely rejected him, um, unless he was willing to babysit.
Mm,
And my oldest was like, I'm not babysitting nine kids,
mm.
because they had two kids together. And
Oh my
I
gosh.
just remember being like, this is a mess. And I'm like, God, why is it such a mess? I followed your every plan. Your plan's supposed to be perfect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I just remember being there was my bedroom at the time in this house had a huge closet, and I made it into this like place where I would just meet God. And I would just put his promises on the wall, and I would journal, and I'd keep my journal in there. And I just had this cozy chair where I would just sit and just bask in his presence and be like, God, here I am. I'm raw. I'm broken. Yet again, here we are. And I'm being honest, but this is not fair. And I remember being like, God, can I like pray those scary prayers that David prayed? And I'm like, is that still a thing? um,
Is that allowed?
and I just remember being so much in pain. And it didn't help because I remember 2 months later, my pastor growing up, his wife, when I moved to Pennsylvania, everything God told me, she came to me with the almost the exact same statement that she felt God was telling her. And so
Mm,
to me, that was confirmation. And when I
mm-hmm.
didn't get kids and I was in Pennsylvania by myself, other than my oldest, she came to me and she was like, well, maybe I didn't hear God. She goes, your kids really need you. You need to come back home. And that was hard to hear because
Right,
this is a woman that I looked as she was close to God. She
right,
must know more than me.
right.
My mom, out of anger, out of pain of what she was seeing happening, would just tell me, how can you as a mom stay in Pennsylvania and listen to God and watch your kids go through pain all by themselves with their dad? You need to move back home. Just move back home and live with us. It was that little dangling of the carrot that
Mm-hmm.
the enemy would use.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was tough. When I say the enemy comes in like a flood, you better make sure that you know that God can raise the standard.
Yeah.
And you better know that God will show up, but you better be ready to be planted and rooted in his truth, because those waves are going to hit you hard.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and in that time, I drew, I painted, I just dwelled myself in any way that I could hear God.
Right.
Because I was like, man, God, I must have missed something. I need to know where I failed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I recognize now, looking back, I was a perfectionist. I didn't want to fail anything. I wanted to achieve it all and achieve it well.
Right.
Um, and it was a process because it was about 9 months before we got the court approval, or got the court paperwork saying that I couldn't have kids, that I could only see them once a month. And that was even shameful because when people would ask you where are your kids, I'd have to say I couldn't have them.
Right.
And then I feel like I'd have to justify it
Right.
because it wasn't right. And I didn't want people to think I was this awful mom. Um, and my children would come to me on the weekend and grip me with death grips. My daughter would cry and not want to go back home and would scream, "Don't send me back." Uh,
Oh, rip your heart out.
and I would hear of these situations that were taking place that were abusive. And so I'd have to witness my children going through trauma that I had sheltered them from during our entire marriage.
Right.
And I'm like broken even further because I'm like, God, where are you for them? They need you more than I need you right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember God saying, trust me. Remember the promise I said, while you're going to walk through the Red Sea and not see it anymore. And about a year later, it was a couple months after we got the orders from the judge. Or at this point, he's my ex. The ex finally calls me and says, I can't financially afford them.
Mm,
Please take them.
there you go.
And you know that at that moment, I was like, oh, this is what God was doing.
Right.
God needed to close that door so it
Mm-hmm.
could never be opened back up again. So
Right.
I could share my story like this without it being opened back up, without having to worry about, is he going to take me back to court
Mm-hmm.
over something little? Is he going to do this yet again?
Right.
Because he would have repetitively done that because he now had money. He now
Yes.
was in a relationship that had funds, had money, and he was doing well off. He had the boat and the big house and the, all the things in the natural world that you would consider as lucrative.
Right.
And meanwhile, I'm over here struggling. And I just remember being like, okay. And I was unemployed at that time. I had lost my job. The job had downsized. They laid off a bunch of people, and I was at that point unemployed. And I remember being at one of those revival events and being like, God, why now? I was doing well financially, and now I'm back at square one of financially being unstable, and I can barely feed myself. And now you want me to bring children in?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember God at that moment because he used the speaker at that time to speak clearly to me. And the speaker came to me and he goes, God wants you to know that your children need you more than you need them. And that
Mm.
you just need to shut up and do what God's telling you to do. And I was like, okay. I was like, shutting up.
Message
Sorry,
received.
God. And I just remember being like, okay. And it helped so much because in that process, he wanted no ability. He was like, I'll see them a weekend every month and 2 weeks in the summer, and we'll alternate holidays. But other than that, I want no financial ties. I don't want to have to pay child support. I don't want to have to pay medically for their stuff.
Mm.
And basically just financially done.
Right. Right.
And I remember being like, okay, God, like, how is this gonna work?
Mm-hmm.
Because like I was depending on some child support. I was
Right.
depending on some other stuff. And I remember God being like, but I'm your provider,
Mm-hmm.
not the world. I'm your provider. I will create waves of wealth for you. I
Mm-hmm.
will open the doors of abundance for you. Um, and so I had to trust God again. And people thought I was crazy. I remember like employers would be like, "Oh, Tara, why don't you just like," because he would call my employers and say, "Is she working there? Is she working there? How much is she making?"
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
and my employers would be like, he called again. They're
Mm.
like, why don't you just go after this man for child support? And I'm like, no. I'm like, God was clear. God was crystal clear. I'm not gonna overstep God.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so through this process, it's been a journey. It's been about, I mean, there were moments where he would call CPS. They would have to check my fridge. I'd have to take pictures of my food. Um,
Oh my
you know,
gosh.
just the nagging stuff that they'd call the school and the school would have to, call me and say, oh, well, your ex called. What would you like to do? And there were moments where I was so fearful and such in a place of like anxiety because I would be so worried that I do one thing wrong
And
that the
you'd lose
kids would
them.
have to go back to that.
Right.
And I didn't want them to have to experience that again. Um, but God taught me over the years that that's not a worry I need to worry about.
Mm-hmm.
That He had already closed that door. And I've watched things change. I had a lot of bitterness when I moved to Pennsylvania. I had a lot of hatred um, you know, towards the ex and even my ex best friend. Like I had a lot of animosity towards what happened. And I again stuffed it, right? And
Right.
God began to unravel that and say, in order for me to use you, you have to let go and forgive. And I remember,
A tall
trip
order.
there. It is, it's a tall one because there were so many times I'd be like, but God, I don't trust women. I don't want anything to do with men. And
And the
I'm just
list goes
done.
on and on.
And the trip there to pick them up, I would have to go up once a month. Still do. But the trip there was about 2 hours, 45 minutes one way.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one time God was like, are you done being angry? Are you done choosing to not forgive these people? And, it was at a point where I was like, God, why am I always being attacked? Why am I always in this place feeling like attacks are coming that like, I don't even put forth? Like, I would watch financial uh, drought happen in my life, and I'd be like, but wait, I like was in a good place financially. I'd watch like crazy things happen, and I'd be like, where did that just come out from, and how did it just soccer punch me out of the blue?
Right.
And I remember asking God one time, what is allowing this to happen? And he was like, you need to forgive. Because when you don't forgive, you put yourself in the middle. And every bout of correction that that person's going through, you're experiencing it at the same time
Mm-hmm.
because you choose to be in the middle.
Right.
And I'm like, ooh, ouch, that's painful. I'm like, okay, so you're telling me I have to step out, but in order to do that, I have to feel all these emotions again, and I
Mm-hmm.
have to let them all go, and I have to forgive. And I remember God on that drive up, him saying, and you're going to forgive in front of your children, and you're going to forgive them out loud.
Wow.
And I was like, that's powerful. I'm like, how am I supposed to do that? Because that's scary. And I remember being like, I know how I'm gonna get you, God. If they're on the front porch, I will forgive. I will forgive them if they are all standing on the front porch, because my children were never like, my children were the only ones on the front porch. They never came out. The door was closed. As soon as I pulled up, they wanted no contact with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, God, go ahead. And I should have known better. But I pulled up in their driveway, and sure enough, all 10 kids and the two of them were all on the front porch. God was like, watch this. I'm going to
Yep.
make it grand.
Yep.
And I just remember stepping out of my car going, okay, God, I'm going to do this scared. I'm just going to do it scared. And I shook, my voice shook, my hands shook, my body was shaking as I like cowardly walked up in a way that I was like a dog being like, okay, I'm here. Um, and I remember being like, I just want to let you know that I forgive you for everything that you did. I need to let that go. I'm forgiving you. And
Wow.
I remember their faces because they were just in like this deer with headlight look. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what? Because they couldn't believe that that's what I chose to do. Like, there was so much animosity and gunfly, and
Mm-hmm.
it was such a mess between the two of us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that I think it came as such a shock. But I will say, when I stepped off their porch, it was like a Mack truck just lifted off my shoulders,
Wow. Mm.
because I didn't realize the weight that that was carrying at that
Sure.
point. And
Sure.
I watched things change in my life. I watched God put people in my life that grew me even further and held me accountable. I watched God use a pastor as a mentor. I watched him put people around me to hold me accountable to saying no and setting clear boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I watched God completely begin to unravel that ball of yarn and start to heal one by one. And
Right.
it was a lot. I remember the pastor at that time. He was my mentor, and he didn't have a church at the time. I call him pastor because he's my pastor now. But I remember him looking at me, and I was like, God told me you're supposed to be my mentor.
Mm.
And he goes, and I remember our first session together, and he was like, I need to be very careful with you because you're fragile. And I was like, what does that mean? Fragile? What does that mean?
Uh-huh.
Now looking back, I was like, this piece that was all glued together with wonderful like kid glue that was barely holding it together. And I needed somebody to come alongside me and show me another level of who God was and unlock doors that I didn't even realize were there.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, And it was at a point where like God was teaching me that I couldn't do this alone.
Right.
I was now at a point, like I recognized that year by myself was like time to really just bask before God in such a place of surrender.
Right.
God taught me just to know who I was in that moment, to recognize who I am, to give me hope to hold on. And then when my kids came back, it was like, oh my gosh, things are actually moving in the
Because you had laid a
direction that,
good foundation.
yes. And the foundation is key because the rest of the house is going to fall if you don't do the foundation.
Exactly.
And I
Wow.
look back at even some of the artwork that I did, and even some of the artwork I did with my children. Like, I remember sitting at the table, and my daughter at the time, she was slapped if she wouldn't speak across the face. And so for her, it was so hard to get her to speak when she
Mm,
first moved back with me.
mm,
So art was our therapy. Art
mm-hmm,
was where we would sit and we would just, I would learn so much about her
mm-hmm,
and where she was at emotionally.
mm-hmm,
My other son had a nervous twitch and would say sorry like 7 times in a row
mm-hmm.
because he was told he needed to say sorry for everything. And it turned into this obsession. And again, art was like our outlet. Um, and I recognized how to use art in a way that was therapeutic, that allowed me to help them have a voice without speaking it out loud.
Right.
And I began to start to show them that everything they went through was not for nothing,
Right.
that they still had purpose, that they were in a place where God was showing them their strength, was showing them how strong they are, and how to become stronger in Him. Um,
Right.
and our bond as a family grew stronger. I was able to start to implement foundations with them as a unit, and we, as a broken family, we became one, and
Wow.
we began to have that solid foundation. And I just remember like things completely changing, and the things God would have for me. There's still, I'm looking in my office and I have this
Mm,
painting of Jesus that I did like years ago, after
mm-hmm.
right after my divorce. It was during the year when the kids were gone, and I have carried that painting with me everywhere.
Mm.
um it's so funny because in my office now, when I meet with clients, they'll be like, wow, it's like I look into that picture and I just see God. And I remember God saying, bring this everywhere that you go.
And you're doing it.
um and I'm doing it, and it's so amazing what God can do and what He does through you, because you
Right.
don't realize what your talents are, until you really are just undone before God,
Right.
until you've reached your max where you're exhausted and no longer trying to figure it out on your own.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I recognize, it's God has a sense of humor too, because today I work as a counselor assistant with women in recovery, and
Wow.
we're talking 38 women. And I despised women after my divorce. I was
And
like,
here
I'm
you
done
are.
with women. And God's like, nope,
Here
watch.
you
I'm going to put
go.
you in the midst of them.
Yep.
Um, but I listen to their stories and I'm like, I wouldn't have the empathy and compassion or be able to connect with them if I had not been through what I've been through.
Exactly.
And it's now looking back, I can see what God meant about going through the Red Sea. That
Mm-hmm.
Red Sea is not about you, and it's not about my kids. Like, I recognize, like, because in that moment, I saw it as okay, everything's going to be grand at one point, and there's going to be this moment where we're going to be on the other side, and everything's going to come crashing down, and I'm going to feel free. But
Mm-hmm.
that wasn't what God was saying. God
Right.
was saying, hey, every broken piece that you have at the moment, I'm going to piece back together, and I'm going to use for my glory, because there's somebody else that needs to hear what you've been through and need to know that I'm real today just as much as I was in biblical times.
Right.
Like
Amen to
the
that.
Bible is real. And he's like, I need you to be able to go through this situation so someone else can know how real I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to see that that's what God meant in that journey and in
Yeah.
that vision. And it's beautiful because now I can look at it as, wow, I've gone through and God has taught me how to have spiritual muscles. God
Right.
has taught me how to stand in the midst of challenges. God's taught me how to be completely raw and honest with Him, even when I'm mad and angry. God's taught me how to completely vouch for myself and learn confidence in who I am and to pray and speak to situations. My son, in the process of the divorce, also lost 4 friends in
Mm.
less than 5 years.
Oh,
And so at one moment, I remember being like, wow, like, I would have never been able to help him if
right.
I had not gone through loss myself.
Right.
And I remember the last one that really hit him hard was during COVID. And I remember God calling me to go home and get my house in order. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking house in order means finances, your house clean, and all that wonderful stuff. And it wasn't, it was God wanted me to go home and be with my children and
Mm-hmm.
connect with them because God knew that my son was going to lose his best friend to
Mm-hmm.
suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And that if I was working full time as a single mom in a job, it wouldn't have been pretty.
Right.
But because of COVID, I was able to go home. I was able to be with my son during that process. I was able to walk him through. And I think sometimes we have to recognize that what God tells us, even though it doesn't make sense in the natural, we still have to trust him.
Exactly. Yes. And that's not always
Because
easy to do.
no, it's not.
So Tara, what would you say where you are right now in your life? What are you passionate about personally and professionally?
Personally and professionally, I would say, um, personally, I am passionate about teaching these values that I've learned through this process to my children so that they don't have to go through the same struggles that I went
Mhm.
through. So they
Excellent.
can be able to learn because so much of my journey, I spent time in prayer, breaking off those strongholds for my children. But
Mm-hmm.
if we don't instill wisdom from what we've been through and teach them the reason behind the situation and be real with them, there's an opportunity for them to pick it right back up.
Right.
And I
Well,
feel like for me, that's a huge passion personally.
mm-hmm.
Um, and professionally, I know God has called me to work with women who have been through a tremendous loss. And
Mm-hmm.
I know now that that's my purpose in life. My purpose is to come alongside another sister and say, this is how we can walk through this.
Wow.
This is how we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Here, I'm going to show you this ladder, even though it's blurry. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm just right here. Just grab my hand. Let's go. Because we're not meant to go through life alone. We're
Right.
not meant to be able to feel alone. And so often we feel isolated and alone. And that's not God's purpose and plan.
Right.
Um, and so for me, like I want to be able to help as many women as I can who are in that same place, whether it's losing a friend or losing a job or losing, a spouse again because of divorce
Or losing your
uh
own identity.
or losing your own identity. Nowadays, that's huge.
Yes.
Uh
Yes.
and so I feel like, that's where God's called me.
Mm-hmm.
He's had me walk through this journey of deep loss and deep grief for a reason.
Right.
Um,
So
and
so
I
with
feel
with all of that said, what would you say is your superpower?
My superpower is an encourager. I have learned to use that role of codependency in a positive way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because codependency, in all honesty, the core is encouragement, right? We want that person to be happy. We want that person to see joy, and we want so badly to focus on all their problems and fix them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we're healthy and we're able to come from a place of stability, we can instead use the encourager card and
Mm-hmm.
really just be that encouragement that someone else needs in that moment. Because sometimes all they need is a word.
Right.
Sometimes all they need is someone to listen to.
Someone
Um,
to validate them.
and validate, yeah.
Yeah.
And so for me, I recognize that along with prayer, like God's called me to be a prayer warrior in the intercessory realm, and that together with the encourager, which I see more in that counseling, realm. I'm in the process of finishing out my counseling. I'm actually looking at finishing and possibly going on further for art therapy. And you know, I just recognize how God can take what you love doing. When I was in high school, I wanted to be an art teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And my art teacher was like, "Nope, you won't make any money. You got to figure out another profession." And I remember being like, "Okay." Um, but God brings it full circle.
Yep.
And I recognize how God just uses your gifts and talents
Mm-hmm.
and gives you an opportunity and a platform to be able to explore those
Yep.
and see how they can bless somebody else.
Yep.
And, for me, I've watched it happen in my family. I've watched, it happen within me. And I don't want to just keep that for myself. That's a gift that somebody else is a superpower that I can
Mm-hmm.
pass on to some other mom, some other woman that's struggling with loss.
Yep.
Because so often we lose our value in life when
Mm-hmm.
loss hits, and
Yep.
we feel like our value in life is gone. Our purpose is no longer there. And I
Right.
want them to know that, like, it's just another chapter in their life.
Yep.
It's just a page turn, and it's okay. And if you choose to remain in that place, that's okay. We can pause there for a minute, but let's see what that next page is going to look like,
Yep.
what that next chapter is going to look like, because, God can do great things in new chapters.
Yep.
And
Definitely.
so I would say that's probably my biggest superpower is,
Yeah.
you know, the cheerleader, I'm
Yeah.
going to come
We all need
alongside
them.
you and grab your hand.
Yep. So, Tara, how would you say that you are living your best life, or as I like to say, living your best dash?
Today, even just where I'm at today, sitting in this seat as a trained counselor, like being able to watch transformation happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's so funny. God is so cool. Most of my clients that are on my caseload are grief and loss.
Mm.
And I'm like, God, you are strategic in every way.
He's quite the chess
Um,
player, isn't he?
yes, he is. And I'm just like, wow, I'm really living this awesome life, because what better way than to be able to stand with people in their journey in the moment where transformation begins to bud,
Mm-hmm.
and transformation begins to take place.
Mm-hmm.
And to see the moment from when they come in and they're distraught and in despair, to the moment when they leave, when they are in this place that they feel like, oh my gosh, I can conquer the world.
Right.
Um, that to me is living my best dash.
Yes.
And watching my children do the same. I am so proud of my children. They have come so far through this journey
Mm-hmm.
with me. They are amazing kids. They have a heart of gold, and they have learned to walk out of this devastation with power.
Wow.
Um, and that to me is living the best dash.
Oh, yes, indeed. Most definitely. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and I'd like to know, are there any final thoughts or words of wisdom that you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, don't give up.
Mm,
You know, if you're in a place where you feel like life is swallowing you up, where you feel like there is no way out, where you're having those thoughts of why not just end my life,
hmm.
don't stop there. Pick up the phone.
Yes.
There's people that are willing to help you. I'm willing to pick up a phone and talk to you, see if there's a way that we can work you out of that pit,
Hmm.
because we're not meant to do life on our own. We're
No.
not meant to remain defeated. Like God has given us everything for life and godliness. But when we are in that pit, we need somebody else to
Yep.
lead the way at times. And
Yep.
so, my biggest encouragement is pick up the phone. Don't
Mm,
allow self sufficiency and pride to keep you in a place of missing the blessings that you have
yep.
in store for you, because there's so much opportunity. And journal, you know, don't keep it all up here, because if you keep it here, eventually your head will explode.
Yes, in many
You'll just
ways.
be at a place of desperation further.
Yes.
Um, but share on paper, use those tools that we have in life so you can be able to work through that really difficult situation.
Hmm.
um because I'm not going to sugarcoat it, it's not fun
No.
and it's not easy, and
No.
there's no magic wonderful pill that or solution I can give you that's going to be like, yes, tomorrow I'm going to feel all better.
Right.
uh but keep putting one foot in front of the other. Look at small victories and celebrate the small victories instead of looking at the bigger picture.
Mm.
Um, because those small victories will link together and create a bigger victory in the long run.
So those are very wise and beautiful words, and definitely I second everything that you just said. Thank you so much, Tara, for being my guest
Yeah.
here today. I mean, you are a true blessing, and I'm so thrilled that you were here to share your story because I will say this is the longest podcast episode that I've had to date. But part of what this is about is you sharing even after defeat after defeat after defeat, obstacle, challenge, all of it, you still kept taking those steps forward and you kept moving to improve your life. And now you are at a point where you are helping others. And that is the foundation of rediscovering your passion and purpose. So thank you very, very much for being here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This was a true blessing. And I just hope that something in my story will help somebody
Mm.
wherever they are at, draw them out of that pit today so they can regain focus, even if it's for 5 minutes. Um,
I know in my heart that that is exactly what's going to happen. So with saying that, when people finish listening to this podcast, how can they get in contact with you?
So right now, I have a Facebook page. It's called Rise to Create. It's if you search with the at sign, it's at I Rise to Create. Um, but they can reach me there on Facebook. You can definitely, like my Facebook page, message me there. My contact information is on Facebook. My phone number is there. Feel free to call me. Um, as well, if you reach out, I can give you a free discovery call where we can see how I can help you, as well as the email. And the email is irisetocreate@gmail.com. So there's lots of ways to connect, but I'm happy just to hear where that person is at and help them be able to pull the pieces together enough to see if we're a good fit, to
Wow.
see if I can come alongside them and help them.
Wonderful. Well, as you know, if you are a faithful follower, you know that in the description of this episode, that is where you're going to find the links that Tara just gave to each one of you. So if you know that whether it is the Holy Spirit or whether it is just your gut telling you, I need to connect with her, you can go to that link in the description, whether you're watching us on YouTube or you're listening on one of the podcast foundations, the platforms. Go to the link in the description, and I know that Tara will be more than happy to connect with you. Once again, thank you very much, Tara, for being here. What
Yes.
a blessing, and thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you.
Well, for all of you listening out there, remember to subscribe and follow this podcast, and bring along your family and friends also, because as you have just learned during this episode, we are sharing stories of people who have gone through probably a lot more challenges than what we ever thought. But the thing is, they never quit. They never stop. And they keep pursuing their passion and purpose to live their very best life and to help others to do the same. So if you'd like to leave a comment or a review, I would greatly appreciate that. But also know I would like for you to check out my website at www.pathwayswithpatty.org. Sign up for a free Zoom chat with me and get my free Pathway to a New Beginning roadmap. So until we meet again, continue to live your best dash and know that life's an adventure. And I want you to enjoy the journey, because your life matters. Thank you for joining us today, and may God bless you all.